Every specific plan ever written for sending humans to Mars has been canceled, delayed, or quietly forgotten. But the dream itself has now survived for over a century without a single human setting foot on the surface, and nobody has ever fully explained why. Not the engineers who wrote the plans, not the politicians who funded and then defunded them, not the scientists who calculated the numbers and knew, even as they published them, that the biology didn't work. The plans burned, the idea kept rewriting itself. That's the story nobody tells, not because it's hidden, but because it's deeply uncomfortable. A dream that outlives every version of itself isn't inspiring, it's a warning. And to understand why the warning matters, you have to go back further than Mars. You have to start with the target that came before it, and the one before that. Because the dream of colonizing other worlds didn't begin with Mars, it began with a cannon. The year is 1865. A French novelist named Jules Verne publishes a book about 3 men fired to the moon inside a hollow metal shell launched from a cannon buried in Florida. He includes the latitude, the crew size, the transit time, the weight of the capsule. He calculates the launch velocity and provides the approximate landing zone. Europe reads it, and a generation of engineers does something that surprises even them. They take it seriously, not as fiction, as a draft. For the next 50 years, the moon is the obvious target. It's close enough to see with the naked eye. It orbits reliably. You can point at it. It feels achievable in a way that distant planets do not, and achievable is the most powerful word in engineering. By the early 20th century, serious thinkers, not dreamers but mathematicians, are calculating trajectories and fuel loads. The moon feels like the first step toward everywhere else. Then someone does the math on the cannon itself. To escape Earth's gravity, a projectile needs to move 8 times faster than a rifle bullet, from a standing start in under a second. The force required to accelerate a metal shell containing 3 people to that speed in that time frame would not kill the passengers dramatically. It would simply compress them into a thin layer on the inside of the rear wall. Verne's cannon would have been, in practice, a very expensive way to coat metal with astronaut. The concept dies the moment it's tested against physics, not against a lack of imagination. But here's what survives. The question. If not a cannon, then what? That question is the inheritance. 20 years after the cannon is ruled out, a Russian schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky answers it with a different idea. A machine that carries its own fuel and burns it gradually, producing thrust not through a single violent explosion, but through a sustained push. A rocket. The dream didn't fail when the cannon died. It upgraded. The moon was the target that taught humanity the first lesson. Brute force doesn't work. Subtlety does. That lesson would be applied, forgotten, and reapplied for the next 100 years. The moon was eventually reached, and what Apollo found confirmed something that had been suspected since the cannon era but never fully confronted. The moon is not a home. No atmosphere, no liquid water. Temperature swings 300 degrees between sunlight and shadow, hot enough to boil water in the sun, cold enough to freeze engine oil in the shade. You can land on the moon, you cannot live there. The dream didn't die, it moved. The reason you know about rockets instead of space cannons is because one failed idea forced one upgrade. That pattern, obstacle, adaptation, inheritance, is the entire engine of everything that came after. The moon pointed at the next target, somewhere farther, somewhere with an atmosphere, somewhere that looked, at least from a distance, more like a second Earth. The dream moved to Venus. It found something it did not expect. In the early 1960s, Venus is not a fantasy destination. It is a serious candidate. It is closer than Mars, about the same distance as a short space trip compared to a very long one. It is almost exactly the same size as Earth. It is covered in thick clouds, which some astronomers interpret as evidence of water vapor, of weather, of a protected surface that might be warm and habitable. Some published scientific papers from this period speculate, carefully but genuinely, that Venus might support life, a tropical world beneath the cloud cover, a jungle planet. The Soviet Union sends probes to find out, 12 of them over a decade. They are called Venera, the Russian word for Venus. Each one was sent into the Venusian atmosphere expecting to survive long enough to report back. None of them last more than about an hour on the surface. The first few were destroyed before they even reach it. The pressure at the surface of Venus is 90 times greater than Earth's, which means standing on Venus without protection feels the same as standing a full kilometer underwater in the ocean, except the water is a dense, hot carbon dioxide atmosphere that doesn't wash over you gently. It presses from every direction simultaneously, crushing metal the way a boot crushes a paper cup. The surface temperature is over 450 degrees Celsius, which is hot enough to melt lead, hot enough to cook the electronics in a spacecraft within minutes of exposure. The Venera probes, reinforced to survive pressures that would destroy a submarine, lasted between 23 minutes and about 2 hours before they were destroyed. Venus didn't just kill the missions, it killed the optimism about proximity. The lesson was simple and brutal. Being close doesn't matter if the environment is lethal. A world doesn't have to be far away to be unsurvivable. It just has to be the wrong world. If you are wondering why Mars colonization plans always begin with discussions of atmospheric pressure and surface temperature, it is because Venus is the reason. Every Mars mission designer alive learned the same first lesson. Test the atmosphere before you commit the crew. What Venus passed forward was not a plan, it was a filter. After Venus, every serious space colonization proposal started with the question the Venera program had forced. What does the atmosphere actually do to a human body? Not what does it look like from a telescope, what does it do? Mars looked survivable by comparison. Thin atmosphere, not crushing, not boiling. Cold, but not instantly lethal. Radiation exposed, but not uniformly fatal on contact. Mars was what was left after Venus removed everything else. The dream arrived at Mars not because Mars was the obvious answer, but because everything before it had failed in a way that eliminated every other option. And then, a German-American engineer sat down with a pad of paper in 1952 and tried to be the first person to build a plan detailed enough to actually execute. His name was Wernher von Braun, and he nearly got everything right. The plan von Braun published in 1952 is extraordinary in its specificity. 10 astronauts, 3 spacecraft assembled in Earth orbit, a transit time of 260 days, the better part of a year, a landing plan, a surface exploration schedule, and a return trajectory. He calculated fuel loads, life support requirements, and launch windows. He included mass budgets for every piece of equipment. He had the engineering, he had the mathematics, he had the optimism of a man who had already helped build the rockets that would eventually take humans to the moon. He had calculated almost everything except one thing: what 260 days of deep space radiation does to human bone marrow. In 1952, the long-term biological effects of sustained radiation exposure in deep space were not fully measured. The data didn't exist. Earth's magnetic field protects us from the worst of what space throws at us, deflecting charged particles from the sun and deep space before they reach ground level. Once you leave that magnetic shield, you are exposed to everything. Radiation that would require mandatory health monitoring for a nuclear plant worker on Earth. Radiation that, during a solar storm, could deliver a dose in hours that would cause acute radiation sickness. And the transit to Mars takes 8 months each way, which means a crew spends 16 months just traveling, before counting a single day on the surface. After a year in space, A human body has lost roughly 30% of its bone density, which means bones that were strong enough for a healthy adult are now as fragile as those of someone who has aged 40 years overnight. A stumble in the habitat corridor doesn't produce a bruise, it produces a fracture. And you can't come home early. The orbital window, the period when Earth and Mars are positioned close enough for a return trip, opens only once every 26 months. Once you leave for Mars, the window closes behind you. Physics decides when you're allowed to go home, not your medical condition. Von Braun's plan wasn't wrong. It was incomplete. He had the machine right. He didn't have the passenger. Every Mars mission timeline you have ever seen, every launch date, every crew roster, every "we'll be there by 2030" announcement is carrying the same incomplete calculation von Braun carried in 1952. The rockets have improved. The biology problem hasn't moved. Put yourself in 1952. The moon turned out to be uninhabitable. No air, no water, temperature swings that would destroy any structure not built to incredible tolerances. Venus turned out to be a furnace. Mars is what's left. It's survivable in comparison. Barely, but survivable. Von Braun has drawn up the plan. The engineering works. The radiation biology is unknown and might be catastrophic, but you won't have the data to confirm or deny it for another decade. You have two choices. You announce the plan now, radiation data incomplete, and trust that the biology will be solved before the launch date. If you wait for complete data, funding dries up, the political window closes, and the idea gets shelved for another generation. Or you say nothing until the biology is solved, knowing that waiting might mean losing the entire program, losing the engineers, losing the momentum that took 50 years to build. Think about it for a moment. Actually think about it. Not as a thought experiment, as a decision with consequences on both sides. Von Braun announced the plan. He bet that the biology would catch up. Every generation since has made the same bet, and every generation since has reached the launch date still waiting for the biology to catch up. After Von Braun, the internal conversation inside NASA was not about whether Mars was possible, it was about when. Internal documents from the late 1960s, actual planning papers, not public relations materials, sketch Mars missions for the early 1980s with the same casual confidence that someone today might sketch a cross-country road trip. The moon landing had just happened. The technology was real. The infrastructure existed. The engineers were at their peak. Mars felt like the obvious next step, 18 months away at most in terms of planning and commitment. What those documents don't account for is what the moon program had cost to produce. Not just money, though the cost was staggering, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's terms. The moon program had consumed an entire generation of engineering talent, an entire manufacturing base, an entire political mandate. The Apollo program existed because a president had made a specific promise in a specific speech with a specific deadline, driven by a specific geopolitical competition. When the moon landing happened, the promise was kept, the competition was won, the mandate evaporated. There was no second speech, no "now we go to Mars" moment that carried the weight of political commitment. Without that weight, without the specific urgency that the space race had provided, the infrastructure that could have built a Mars mission was gradually disassembled. Engineers moved to other projects, manufacturing lines closed, institutional knowledge dispersed. By the mid-1970s, the internal NASA documents that had casually sketched 1980s Mars missions were artifacts from a different era, already outdated before they were archived. Mars didn't fail in this period because it was impossible. It failed because the moon had used up the world's appetite for committing everything to a single target. The moon taught humanity something that the Cannon era and the Venus era had not, that political will is a fuel, and it burns just like any other fuel. When it's gone, the rocket stops. That lesson, that political will is a finite resource, not a renewable one, is the reason every Mars announcement since 1969 has come with an expiration date. The will arrives in a speech, the speech fades, the plan follows it. The dream didn't die in the 1970s, it went dormant, and 17 years later, a president stood at a podium and did what every generation eventually does. He announced that this time it was finally going to happen. July 20th, 1989, the 20th anniversary of the moon landing. President George H.W. Bush stands at the National Air and Space Museum and announces the Space Exploration Initiative, humans back to the moon and then to Mars. The goal is Mars by the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. That would be 2019. He gives the speech with the confidence of a man who believes the announcement is the hard part. The cost estimate that comes back from NASA shortly after is so large, some analyses put it at $500 billion over 30 years, that the program is never seriously pursued. It is quietly shelved within a few years, without ceremony. George Bush announces the Vision for Space Exploration in January 2004. Humans back to the moon by 2020, Mars sometime after that. He gives the speech with similar confidence. Barack Obama cancels the moon return component in 2010 and replaces it with a direct-to-Mars commitment instead. He gives his own speech, different podium, same dream, same confidence. A timeline is discussed, asteroids first, then Mars, sometime in the 2030s. Each of these announcements is genuine. None of these men is lying about the ambition. The plans that follow each announcement are real plans, with real engineers, real timelines, and real hardware discussions. The gap is not in the sincerity. The gap is in the biology. 3 different presidents, 3 different speeches, 3 different timelines, each canceled within a decade by budget pressure, by changed priorities, by the same structural gap between announcement and commitment that killed the 1969 internal planning documents. Here's what none of the speeches mentioned. A nuclear plant worker on Earth who absorbs as much radiation over a working career as a Mars transit crew would accumulate in 16 months of travel, just getting there and back before a single day on the surface, would face mandatory health monitoring for the rest of their life. That's not a Mars-specific data point, that's an industrial safety standard applied to any human body absorbing that level of radiation exposure. For comparison, astronauts currently living on the International Space Station, people who are already in space, already outside most of Earth's protective atmosphere, receive less than a quarter of that radiation dose per year, and they can be home in 3 hours if something goes wrong. They have an escape hatch. Mars crews don't. The orbital window that allows a return doesn't open on medical demand. It opens every 26 months on physics' schedule, regardless of what is happening inside anyone's body. The speeches never mentioned this because speeches are about possibility, and the radiation math is about limits. The dream kept getting announced. The biology kept getting filed away for later. The later never came. Here is where we actually are. The rocket exists, not as a sketch, not as an internal NASA document, as a physical object that has launched, that has returned to its landing pad under its own power, that can, in principle, carry enough payload to reach Mars. The hardware gap that stopped every previous generation, the absence of a vehicle capable of the journey, is closer to being closed than at any point in the history of this dream. And the biology problem is exactly what it was in 1952. The radiation still accumulates. 16 months of transit, 8 months out, 18 months on the surface waiting for the return window, 8 months home, exposes a crew to radiation levels that a nuclear plant safety officer would classify as a serious long-term health risk. The bones still weaken. After a year in weightlessness, a person arrives at Mars with a skeleton that has lost roughly 30% of its density, which means a body that left Earth healthy and young arrives at Mars with bones that fracture under stresses they once absorbed without complaint. Imagine the first person to land on Mars. Day 1 on the surface. She climbs down the ladder. She takes the first steps a human has ever taken on another planet. She feels the thin Martian air against her suit, lighter than Earth's in every way that matters. Not enough pressure to breathe unaided, not enough atmosphere to block the radiation still arriving from the sun and deep space. She doesn't feel the radiation. She won't feel it for years. But the math started running the moment her ship left Earth orbit. The same math von Braun ignored in 1952. The same math NASA set aside in 1989. The same math every presidential speech declined to mention. By year 3 on the surface, her cancer risk has doubled. By year 5, it has doubled again. She is paying in her body for every generation that looked at this problem and decided to solve it later. Muscle atrophy is measurable within weeks in weightlessness. Psychological degradation, the slow erosion of decision-making quality, of emotional stability, of the ability to function in a small team under sustained stress, is documented in every long-duration isolation study ever conducted. None of these problems is theoretical. All of them are present in 2026. None of them has a complete solution. Here is where the story becomes yours. The rocket exists. The launch window is real. The biology problem, radiation, bone loss, muscle and psychological degradation across roughly 900 days of mission time, has no complete solution. You are the mission director. You have 2 choices, and neither is clean. You send a crew now. The hardware works. The engineers are ready. The political window, the combination of funding, public interest, and institutional momentum, is open right now, in a way it has not been open since 1969. If you wait for the biology to be solved, history tells you what happens. The funding shifts, the engineers move on, the political window closes, and the next generation inherits the same dream at the same wall. That pattern has repeated across 70 years with remarkable consistency. Or you wait, the biology isn't solved. Sending people now means accepting clearly and honestly that some of them will pay for it with their health or their lives. That's not a calculation error or a risk you can engineer away. It is a known gap that you are choosing to proceed past. The crew would know it too. They would volunteer anyway. People have always volunteered for missions where the return was uncertain, where the cost was their body, where the dream was larger than the individual carrying it. Both choices cost something that cannot be returned. A crew sent with unsolved biology is a crew that pays personally for the gap between ambition and medicine. A program delayed while waiting for perfect conditions has, historically, never launched at all. Think about it, not as an abstract policy question, as a decision you are personally responsible for. This is the decision every generation has faced. It is the decision being faced right now in 2026 in offices where people are doing real calculations on real timelines. They have not answered it any more cleanly than von Braun answered it in 1952. Neither have you just now. The dream survived, not because each generation solved the problem. It survived because the fear underneath the dream, The understanding, rational and persistent, that one planet is a single point of failure for everything that has ever lived on it never went away, regardless of how many plans burned. Today, the rockets are real. The destination is mapped at a resolution that would have seemed miraculous in 1952. The biology problem, radiation accumulation, bone density loss, muscle atrophy, psychological isolation across 900 days in a confined space, is better understood than it was in von Braun's era. It is not solved. The understanding of a wall is not the same thing as the wall coming down. Every person alive right now will be here to see whether the next generation clears it or adds another decade to the timeline. Not as observers at a safe distance, as the generation that either watched it happen or watched it be postponed again. You are not reading about history here. The history ends in 1952, in 1969, in 1989, in 2004, in 2010. What comes next is not history. It is a question that has been waiting for over a century for someone to give it an answer that actually holds. The dream refused to die because the need behind it is real. One planet, one magnetic field, one geological event, one large enough impact, one viral outbreak, one slow climate shift away from being the last address of everything we have ever built or loved or understood. Mars was always the answer to a question we haven't fully admitted we're asking. The question is still open, the wall is still there, and somewhere, right now, an engineer is drawing a plan.